Okay. Oh, no.
Wait a second. No, no, oops. I hit, sorry, I hit start webinar by mistake. Start webinar by mistake.
Does that mean, that's okay, but does that mean we've let anybody in yet? See if I recognize anyone from, I certainly do, from the chat. From the attendee list. Again, hi everyone. Oh, Alicia's from Chicago. Oh, that's so nice of you who don't even live in the desert Southwest to tune in. Okay, what does, let's see.
Dayton, Tampa, Chicago, Cleveland.
Hey. Atlanta. Hi, Raquel. Oh, and Eric's also from St. Louis.
Buffalo.
Wow.
St.
Well, so
Louis?
far, is there anyone here from the desert Southwest
Oh,
besides
no, not yet.
Lori and me?
Well, I mean, if people are expecting tips on where they should buy,
Yeah.
this isn't, I'm not sure you're going to get it. Wichita, no.
You know, William, Alan and I just had an embarrassing time of trying to remember all the major cities in Kansas. We had to go look at a map. And I grew up in the Midwest, so I have no excuses.
I think it was.
We
the one
missed Topeka.
We missed Topeka. Yeah, we completely forgot about Topeka. I don't know why.
If you're joining us just now, we're typing into the chat where you're tuning in from. I'm in Tucson, Arizona. And we also have on our team here, well, let's see, I always forget. We've got Plano, Texas and Ithaca, New York, but Alan, what's the name of your small village in New Jersey?
Roosevelt, New Jersey. Population 900.
Oh, Philip lived in the White Mountains. Oh, for Southern Navajo County. Oh, fantastic. It's so interesting to me, maybe not to anyone else, but if you ever have time to kill and you want to look at the county map, the county boundaries in Arizona, they're very oddly shaped, and there are two very tall and narrow counties. One is Navajo and the other one is Apache that are side by side. Am I right about that, Philip?
Well, I just pulled up the map. Yeah, they're basically long and narrow. They make up more or less the northeast part of the state.
Yeah, Philip says it took a day to drive from tip to stern.
Wow.
Okay, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. I am Marcia Nedland and I am a consultant, but I'm also one of the organizers for the National Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice, which I'll talk about in a moment. And today we're going to be talking about middle neighborhood trends in the desert Southwest. We also are able to release the written report today. So Anne will make sure that's in the chat again at some point. I think I've already put it in there once. What we're going to do today is I'm going to do a couple of introductory slides just to set the table for why we did the study. And then Alan will report on our findings. And then Lori Schwartz, who is a city, runs the neighborhoods program in the city of Plano, Texas, and is also the chair of the National Middle Neighborhood Steering Committee, will describe for us her middle neighborhoods strategy in Plano, Texas, and some recent new results that she got from some data analysis. And then we'll have time for discussion and Q&A. So the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative is a national initiative. It's basically focused on mobilizing attention on middle neighborhoods, which are having a very tough time of it across the country. In many, many places, they're either disappearing because they're of going into decline or through gentrification. So basically, this initiative is trying to have everyone check in on their middle neighborhoods and develop some strategies to intervene now before it's, a much more expensive situation to correct. We do this through research, policy analysis, communications, and advocacy at the steering committee level, and NCST, the Neighborhood Community Stabilization Trust, organizes that side of our work. The other half of our work is the Community of Practice, and that is organized by NeighborWorks America. And we basically facilitate peer-to-peer learning among middle neighborhood practitioners. We're actually up to more than 800 people in the community of practice now, and we're definitely going to encourage you to join us. So just to sort of set the stage for our middle neighborhoods work, I'm going to do a couple of slides that are characteristics of mostly middle neighborhoods east of the Mississippi. That's where we really started from, where we had the most interest in the beginning, and our interest is spreading west. But what we see there is that middle neighborhoods are mostly single family homes built for families with children. They're still well more than 50% owner occupied, but if you look at their long-term trends, that may be eroding. The housing stock is aging, but in decent condition. The problem is usually that it lacks some features that are what current home buyers are looking for today, such as a second bathroom. Property values range from, this is before the pandemic, slow decline, or just sort of flat, to underperforming against the city or underperforming against inflation. We're actually looking at research this year to see whether we can, whether the situation has permanently changed about housing values and whether that's requires a different set of strategies. One of the things I find very interesting about middle neighborhoods is they're more racially and ethnically diverse than most other neighborhoods, and they are also economically diverse. So they're more economically diverse than low-income neighborhoods or high-income neighborhoods. Go ahead. So what are we doing? Whoops. Oh, okay. So our concerns about middle neighborhoods that got the National Middle Neighborhoods Initiative going are that we were noticing that these neighborhoods were faltering in their sustainability. A lot of people sort of, in terms of policy, strategy, funding, middle neighborhoods have not been substantially, on the radar. They're thought to be able to carry on their own and have some kind of self-sustaining market mechanism. But we've been noticing that they're faltering in their ability to attract the replacement owner occupants, that they need to stay largely owner occupied, to generate home values that would support quality maintenance, repairs, and updates without running into appraisal gaps. We see investors moving in great quantities, some of them not the best investors. And then all of that takes its toll on sort of the network of engaged residents that manage day-to-day issues in the neighborhood. And finally, there's this whole issue of, can these neighborhoods still deliver home equity to the owners that live there and revenue to municipal governments that are responsible for their ongoing health? As I've alluded to, this movement started growing from the Northeast, especially in legacy cities. We're a pretty young movement, only about 6 years old. More of our members are in the Northeast and Midwest than in either the South or the West. And so we really wanted to learn about middles in places that have very different economies and demographics. The Southwest has an utterly different economy than the Midwest or the Northeast. And so we wanted to learn about how that has a different effect on middle neighborhoods, if it does. And so we want to then translate this information and this knowledge into how can the initiative be more useful to middle neighborhoods and practitioners in middle neighborhoods in the Southwest. So today, we're going to start with Alan Malik. Alan is a senior fellow at the Community Center for Community Progress. He's a city planner in previous lives, an advocate and a writer. You probably all know him. He's does important research on neighborhoods steadily. He's authored several studies for us, especially focused on legacy cities and on Black middle neighborhoods. He wrote 2 chapters in our book, On the Edge, and his most recent book is The Divided City, Poverty and Prosperity in Urban America. So Alan's gonna run his own slides from his computer. There he is. He even has a background of, what'd you decide that was from?
I think it's Albuquerque.
Okay.
So happy to be here. And I'm going to say a little bit about what we did. Now this, again, I want to stress, it's a first look. So this is not the definitive word on the subject, just an effort to take a quick look at some basic middle neighborhood characteristics in half a dozen cities in the desert Southwest. So the first thing is we picked a bunch of cities of different sizes, divided across the region. And one of the things we looked at is cities that were basically middle income cities to begin with. In other words, we didn't want a city that was particularly poor or a city that was particularly affluent. So we're looking at those in the middle of the pack. And these are the ones we picked. And as you can see, they're quite a mix. Here is how they distribute in a variety of indicators. So some of them are somewhat poor, some are more affluent, some of them have different age distributions, but they're all relatively similar. One thing that's quite interesting is that they all have much larger Latinx populations than the United States as a whole. And again, their incomes are all pretty close to the United States as a whole. So this is a pretty good cross section in a way of what you might call middle America, or at least Southwestern middle America. Now, all of them, at least up to now, have had relatively middling housing markets, except for Lubbock is kind of a bit of an outlier here, that despite the fact that it's more of a middle income community, it has a much lower housing market level than the other cities, which are all in fairly similar place. As you can see, during the past year, this is actually from spring of 20, from the beginning of the pandemic, during the first year of the pandemic, they all saw pretty significant increases. Phoenix, which for some reason that I don't understand, is by a lot of indicators the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States, has had a dramatic increase in house prices. So what we looked at, again, there's no hard and fast definition of the middle neighborhood, but one of the reasons why we took cities that were in the middle of the pack in terms of the general economy is that we could then say, okay, people with incomes in 80 to 120% of the city median would be considered middle income, and neighborhoods where the median fell into that range would be considered middle neighborhoods. So this just illustrates what that means in the case of Phoenix. In round numbers, it's neighborhoods where the median income today is roughly between $45,000 and $70,000, which I think is a reasonable definition. So that's what we looked at. And as you can see here also, we looked at low, moderate, upper middle, and upper income neighborhoods as well. Because one of the things that's interesting is to see how the distribution within these 5 categories shifts over time. So the first thing we see is that they're not consistent. There's a lot of difference between these cities in terms of the middle neighborhoods. So for example, almost 45% of all neighborhoods, and when I say neighborhoods, I'm talking about census tracts, which is the usual way. Almost 45% of neighborhoods in Albuquerque are middle neighborhoods, but less than 35% in Fresno, for example. And in these three cities, we see that Albuquerque, Vegas, and Fresno have seen dramatic drops in the share of census tracts that are still middle neighborhoods today, while in Lubbock, Arlington, and Phoenix, the number has stayed basically steady. So if we zoom in on Fresno, for example, one of the cities which has lost a lot of middle neighborhoods, see an interesting thing. What's happened, and you can see in the two maps, the gray are the middle neighborhoods, and the different colors of, I guess, orange or yellow are lower income, and blues are upper income. So what you see very clearly in Fresno, in particular, is there's been a shift towards low-income neighborhoods, massive growth in the number of low-income neighborhoods, some growth in the number of upper middle-income neighborhoods, but along with the dramatic decline in the middle neighborhoods. And you can see it in the map. In Las Vegas, there's also been a sharp decline in middle neighborhoods. But there it's translated into growth in moderate income neighborhoods and upper income. So what we're seeing is a lot of shifts, but they don't seem to follow the same pattern. Albuquerque, growth in moderate, growth in upper middle. But in all of these cases, you're seeing shifts away from middle neighborhoods and towards greater income polarization by neighborhood, which reflects national trends. Another important thing is that by and large, that in fact, in all 6 cities, the share of middle neighborhood population that is Latinx has grown significantly in the last 20 years. And in fact, in 3 of the cities, Phoenix, Lubbock, and Arlington, well, the Latinx share is less in the middles than in the city as a whole. In the other 3, it's the other way around. And so, for example, in Albuquerque, Latinx people are a little more than 40% of the population, but over 50% of the population in middle neighborhoods. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as we see how these neighborhoods are evolving. Another area we looked at is that by and large, the share of households with married families with children has been dropping significantly in these neighborhoods. In fact, interestingly, today, the only city of the 6 where the share of married families with children was the same as the national average was in Arlington. In all the others, it was lower. In Vegas, Albuquerque, much lower. And what we see is that very much, and this again, it reflects national patterns, but I think it's somewhat more pronounced in some of these cities, is that being married families with children tend to be more affluent than most other types of families, and they tend to cluster in upper income neighborhoods increasingly. So especially in Las Vegas. Now, another thing worth looking at are home ownership rates. And here you can see that the home ownership rate dropped, but only slightly in the United States between 2000 and 2019. And by and large, the trend was not that different in the southwestern cities. But what was noticeable is how much lower homeownership is in most of these cities than nationally. And what it reflects, interestingly, it does not reflect any difference in the basic housing type, because these are primarily single family cities. It reflects more than anything else the extent to which single family housing has increasingly become rental housing in these cities. And again, in a few cities, well, Phoenix and Fresno in particular, there's been a significant drop in home ownership in middle neighborhoods. Less so or not at all in the other cities. So again, this is very much a mixed pattern. This is an important point. There is no consistent pattern in terms of the trajectory or the characteristics of middle neighborhoods in these cities. Finally, we looked at vacancy rates. And again, vacancy rates in the United States have risen significantly from 2000 to 2019. A lot of it is still fallout from the effects of the Great Recession and the foreclosure crisis. And they have risen in these cities. But as you can see here, if we look at the cities, the different neighborhood characteristics, where you have a significant problem, let me go back, with vacancies is really only in the low income neighborhoods. So even though vacancy rates have gone up, they're not at levels which are a serious worry. So I think one thing that's clear about this picture, this very mixed picture, is that you don't have the consistent pattern of middle neighborhoods in crisis that you have in the Northwest, Northeastern, and Midwestern legacy cities. What you have is a very mixed picture with middle neighborhoods thriving in some cities, but struggling more in others. And in fact, then we looked at Fresno and Phoenix, a little more detail, looking at some other indicators. And so what we found when we looked at Fresno, we looked at elderly population, foreign-born population, single women with children households, non-family households, education level, median mortgage amount from HMDA data, and poverty rate. So what we found in Fresno is very interesting, as you can see by where the red boxes are concerned. We tried to find where there was consistent patterns cutting across different neighborhood income levels. And what we found astonishingly is that the middle neighborhoods in Fresno are actually an extension of low and moderate income neighborhoods. They're not really middle neighborhoods. They are really part of the same lower income pattern. And there's a big gap between them and the upper, middle, and upper income neighborhoods in terms of house prices, demographics, immigration population, non-family households, and so forth. So, which of course means that middle neighborhoods in Fresno are more likely to be at risk than in other cities because they're kind of close to the edge of being middle. But I thought I had a separate one for Phoenix here, but apparently I don't. But in any case, in Phoenix, what we found, I looked at the same indicators and found there, middle neighborhoods are very much a distinct category of neighborhood, distinct demographically and economically and in their housing markets from both low and moderate on the one hand and upper, middle, and upper on the other. So based on this, let me throw out a couple of conclusions and then some possible suggestions in terms of the implications of these findings. The first one, as I've said, is that there's not a consistent pattern. And one thing that this reflects is the fact that in contrast to Midwestern and Eastern cities, when you look at basic migration trends, the immigration to cities like whether it's Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland, Kansas City, others, the people who are moving into those cities tend to be either young college educated people who tend to be in many respects gentrifiers, and they typically have higher incomes, or in many cases immigrant communities. And there are growing immigrant communities in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore. But the middle income households, as a general rule, are not moving into Northeastern and Midwestern cities. They are, however, moving from the Northeast and Midwest into Southwestern cities. The immigration into places like Phoenix, Dallas, Las Vegas is not affluent, young college graduate techies. It is middle income working families. And this is replenishing the stock of middle income households, and in some cases, the stock of middle neighborhoods, but not necessarily. The other big demographic factor in Southwestern cities is the growth of the Latinx population and the growth of the Latinx population in middle neighborhoods. And that's an important trend. Again, homeownership rates are stable in some, not in others. Vacancy rates are rising, but they're not problematic at this point for the most part. And again, the question of child rearing married couple households is an interesting one, because that group has historically been an important market, an important part of the composition of middle neighborhoods. So as that group declines nationally, that could have implications for middle neighborhoods in the Southwest as well, even though a lot of those households are in fact moving from other parts of the country to the Southwest. In terms of implications, I mean, the key thing from a local government standpoint is to know the territory, track trends in these neighborhoods, and identify potential threats to their stability. An important part of any middle neighborhood strategy is fostering stable home ownership, which is both encouraging home buyers, especially, which becomes especially important with the pressure from a lot of investor money looking at these markets as a rental housing opportunity, but also to encourage, to make sure that existing homeowners have the support they need to stay homeowners. Third part is, especially in areas where there seems to be erosion of homeownership, is to build stronger markets in these neighborhoods by making sure that they're attractive, that they have good public services and attractive amenities such as access to shopping, parks, and other things. And then finally, build neighborhood identity. Neighborhoods in their way are just as much part of the urban fabric or the suburban fabric in the Southwest as they are in the Northeast, even though we don't think of them in similar terms. So building the identity of people around their neighborhoods and fostering their engagement with the neighborhood in terms of making it a better community is a critical task for local government. And I suspect that Lori will have a fair amount to say about this in the next presentation. So let me hand it back to Marcia to introduce Lori, and hopefully we'll get some things going here.
Thank you, Alan. I was reminded of something when you were talking about, recommendations, that one of the stories that we feature in the report is about a program that the city of Arlington, Texas does, which I think is extremely interesting. Anne actually wrote a case study about it. So if I don't get the details right, Anne, please chime in. But as I understand it, the city sort of keeps an eye on managing the balance of sort of their, higher income, middle income, and more modestly priced housing stock. And they are aware that a lot of their middle housing stock is aging and not showing itself all that well in terms of, next round of home buyers. So they created an incentive program that is sort of tied psychologically to the concept that your taxes may go up if you actually improve your home, although it is not actually a reduction in taxes. So first of all, they set it at I think it's something like that. It has to be at least $20,000 of improvements, and they arrived at that number because it's something like 10% of the median home value in in the city. And if those improvements are made, then they calculate what that would increase, how much that would increase property taxes, and basically write a check to the homeowner for 10 times that amount. So, psychologically, it feels like you're getting 10 years of tax abatement, even though it comes out of a completely different source of funds. But what I like about that program is that it's not income limited. It's meant to update all of the housing stock in the city. And it's, designed, I think, really cleverly to, inspire substantial home improvement or updating, and to get at the concerns that homeowners actually have about tax increases.
If I could just jump in, one quick observation on that point. What's very interesting is that, and we tend to not really appreciate how old most of the housing stock in a lot of these cities that developed after World War II has become. A house that was built in 1960, and there are a lot of them in these areas, is now over 60 years old. And these houses were not built to the highest possible standards in many cases. They were basic first-time home buyer housing for GIs returning from the war and all that sort of thing. And a lot of the neighborhoods in these southwestern cities are now at a point where they definitely need upgrading or renewal or revitalization. Mm-hmm. So we tend not to think about it in those terms, but it's very much a reality.
Yeah. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Lori. There she is. She is our certified planner among us all, and she's director of neighborhood services for the city of Plano. Lori and I met actually at a NeighborWorks Training Institute class where she was a student and I was the class leader, but I found every single thing she said I wish I'd said myself. So from that point onward, I never let her out of my sight for very long. She is the chair of our National Middle Neighborhood Steering Committee, and I think she definitely brings something to the table that's just an important concept in middle neighborhoods, which is that a lot of middle neighborhoods are suburban. They're first-ring suburbs often. And although Plano is large enough to be its own independent city, it is also in the periphery of Dallas. Lori's an urban planner with more than 15 years of experience in all of those things. She is very creative, I can tell you from watching her work in designing programs and really interpreting market data and figuring out how to respond to that data. She's also the co-founder of the Neighborhood Engagement and Revitalization Alliance, which connects all the Dallas-Fort Worth suburban governments and is sort of a community practice for them to watch trends together and figure out the best strategies to move forward. So I think we're going to let Lori take over control.
Good morning, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen with everybody. So give me 1 second. All right. So hopefully everybody can see my screen at this point. But I am just hoping to bring some perspective to how we're addressing middle neighborhood work in the city of Plano. I have really enjoyed our partnership with NeighborWorks, Middle Neighborhoods, and then Marcia and Alan, because it's been so encouraging to see the work that's being done nationally, but then also to be able to share some of the things that we've had as success here in Plano. So just to give you just a little bit of general information about us, I don't know if everybody knows about Plano, but we are a first ring suburb of Dallas. And this graphic right here just shows the jurisdictions within the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Plano's located approximately 20 miles northeast of downtown Dallas and is the 4th largest city in the Dallas-Fort Worth region. It's also the 9th largest city in Texas. So just some basic demographic information is included on this slide, but I did want to point out our low vacancy rate and high median income, as well as some of our high percentage minority populations. And many of our middle neighborhoods have largely Hispanic and Asian residents, as seen in other Southwest middles. Also, just one of the other thing, just because we're doing a lot of housing studies at this point, just wanted you to note that we are about a 60-40 mix between single family and multifamily. So we have a substantial number of different types of housing other than just single family here in Plano. So the majority of our housing units were built from the 1960s into early 2000s, and we were a fast growth city. So you can see here, this is our historic little downtown area, which was didn't grow a whole lot early on. The yellow and the orange on this map are homes built in the 1960s and 70s, and most of these neighborhoods right here are located within our middle neighborhoods. So this just shows you we kind of had concentric growth kind of coming from this small little area right here. So this map shows our self-identified middle neighborhoods by census tract. And so you can see some change in our middle neighborhoods from the 2010 ACS to the 2020 ACS. So the yellow highlighted areas here, these are middle neighborhoods that existed both in 2010 and in 2020. So you can see that those were relatively stable. So orange here, and then up here and down here, they were middle neighborhoods that existed in 2010, but now are above the Plano median income. And the blue represent neighborhoods that were middle neighborhoods in 2010, but now are below the Plano median income. So it's kind of interesting to just see the shifts. There doesn't seem to be a very clear pattern about why that's changing in those areas. But I think it's really interesting just to kind of understand what's going on as far as where our middle neighborhoods are existing here in Plano. So our housing units through the 1980s primarily remained moderately sized, one-story, Southwestern influenced ranch homes, and then also neo-Tudor. And so the middle neighborhoods are full of these homes with relatively dense lots and mature trees. In the most recent housing stock that's coming in, our newer housing, it's primarily two-story brick homes, and they have less architectural style influences. So you can see quite the contrast between our middle neighborhoods, our older neighborhoods, and some of our newer neighborhoods that are coming in. So this is just an overview of Plano demographics that aligns with the Desert Southwest study. And so as you can see, we follow other cities studied with a generally lower Black population, but higher Latinx population. But in Plano, our Asian population is even higher than the Latinx population, which is different from the other cities in the study. One of the other ways that you can see that we also differ is in our median income. As you can see, Plano has a significantly higher median income than national average. Our share of populations that live in middle neighborhoods has stayed relatively consistent from 2010 to 2020, with approximately a quarter of our population living in middle neighborhoods. So this is going to be pretty similar to Fresno and Las Vegas that Alan just touched on. Our middle neighborhoods have a more balanced distribution of minority populations than neighborhoods with either higher or lower income. So you can see that there's a lot more consistency here in our middle neighborhoods. You'll see that it significantly shifts with Asian population going to some of our upper income neighborhoods, and our Latinx population going to more of our low to moderate income neighborhoods. And this is just another graph showing very similar data, just kind of drawing it across the percentage points. So changes in the percentage of households that are child-rearing married couples for middle neighborhoods and cities. This is an interesting graphic for us. Alan just mentioned that a lot of the middle neighborhoods are the ones that have married couples with children. We are different. Oh, sorry, I'm not this slide. This is actually, let me skip forward. This is showing our middle neighborhoods. So our married couples with children has actually grown in our middle neighborhoods, which is a little bit different. So we are seeing actually the return of some of our families into our middle neighborhoods. Although in Plano, you can see generally we're following the rest of the population. So our middle neighborhoods are actually gaining the families, which we found was a kind of a fascinating piece of information as we were looking at these studies. But you know, it's more aligned with what's going on with the United States. But home ownership in Plano is lowered, and that's across the board in Plano, and it's also reflected in our middle neighborhoods as well as nationally. We are seeing a slightly higher housing vacancy rate in 2020 than we did in 2010, which is a different trend, I think, than maybe is being seen nationally. One of our challenges that we have here in Plano is that we have a very strong housing market with significant increases in value over the last, really since the recession ended. And so we are seeing investors purchasing houses for asset growth rather than for rental properties. So our vacancy is a little different than maybe what is seen in other areas. And then these are just a couple of other characteristics of Plano's middle neighborhoods, including our very high percentage of older adults, also foreign-born citizens, and those with college degrees. So our demographic shows how important it is to understand each city's middle neighborhoods and who lives there to better design and implement programs to enhance and support these neighborhoods in your own communities. So, you know, as Alan said, you know, there's just not consistency when you look at middle neighborhoods. And I think when you look a little closely at what Plano is seeing, that's just a better representation of also why it's so important to do this work and analysis to understand what's going on in your own community. So I wanted to just give a brief timeline of our work in Plano middle neighborhoods. You know, as Marcia had mentioned, this movement has really only been around for about 6 years, but we started doing middle neighborhoods based work back in the 2010. So a few of our programs highlighted some of our very earliest efforts to stabilize middle neighborhoods. Love Where You Live has been in existence for over 10 years, and it represented a conscious choice to move from neighborhood plan-based work into more active revitalization efforts. Just to give you a little bit of background, I was hired in 2013 to the city of Plano as the comprehensive planning manager within the planning department. And this position moved the planning department really more from a growth mode for long range planning and then also into more neighborhood revitalization based efforts. 2013 and 2014 were key years in establishing the foundation for our work in middle neighborhoods. We completed a housing value retention analysis study that I'm going to explain just a little bit more about in the next few slides. And then we had two key investment programs, the Great Update Rebate, which is similar to the program that Marcia just mentioned in Arlington, and then Neighborhood Vitality and Beautification grants. Both of these were funded during this time period. And the funding for these programs has remained steady for the last 7 years at $500,000 for the home improvement rebate and $300,000 for neighborhood grants. And then in 2015, the city manager decided to create the Neighborhood Services Department, and that combined two departments, Property Standards Department, and then two divisions of the Planning Department, Community Services and Neighborhood Planning. And so we have been running full steam ever since then. So we began first by looking at our housing market, and this was really to create data-driven programs to specifically address neighborhood challenges specific to our city, but with an understanding of our context within the Dallas-Fort Worth region. We continue to work on these housing studies, and one of the things that I find fascinating about this particular study is the housing value retention analysis, because we were worried about having our housing value retained. And if you have looked at anything about the Dallas region at this point, you know that our housing market has gone out of the roof. And so it's kind of interesting to look back at just the change over the last 7 years. But our city was designed utilizing the neighborhood unit planning method. So our data is based on these approximately 1 mile squares. So basically, we had absolutely no idea what was coming over the next 5 years. So I'm going to kind of touch on a little bit about what was going on. But we looked at very specific factors, both within neighborhoods as well as the retail areas that are gateways into these neighborhoods. We have kept this same kind of neighborhood analysis and assessment and are redoing these assessments every 2 years. We keep tweaking the data a little bit so that we're keeping a good eye on neighborhood trends, how people are maintaining their homes, how retail corners are taking care of themselves. So there's a number of things that we've done, and think that that has just been key to understanding what's changing. So we've got a couple of different assessment models that we look at to understand neighborhood health. So as we came together as the new Neighborhood Services Department, we began working together cooperatively to develop our strategic plan and then also our pillars of action. So HOPE, Outreach, Partner, and Enforce spells, I'm sorry, it's not HOPE, HELP, spells hope. And this really was the way that we built our pillars of action. And then we also have beneath it, our staff stated why our work is so important to the community is that we create hope. And then we all propel positive change so that people are proud to call Plano home. So these are our programs initiatives that are part of our pillars of action. So it's use of volunteers, educational outreach, partnership through grants and resources, and then enforcement of city codes and ordinances. So back in 2010, 2012, we designed the Neighborhood Enhancement Tool, which is basically a heat map to understand neighborhood-based risk factors. And the blue areas are those that are most at risk here in Plano. I want to be specific that these risk factors are calibrated to the city of Plano. You know, if you looked at it in the larger region, it would have a whole lot less variation as you see in these maps. But that also is why it's so important to kind of look at yourself both within the city limits as well as your context within the entire region that you're in. So this is the 2010 net map. And if you look at this, most of our middle neighborhoods are in that darker green area. And then we're going to just kind of show you how how these areas have changed over time. So this is 2015, and you will notice that the darker green and the darkest blue areas are starting to shrink. And then this is 2019, and you will see that the darker green areas have shifted further north, and then the blue areas continue to shrink and shift slightly. So I'd mentioned Love Where You Live, and so Love Where You Live is primarily utilized in the darkest blue areas or those that are in highest risk. And so you can get a good idea of the neighborhoods that we have worked within, and we are continuing to work. We have gone back to a couple of these neighborhoods more than once over time because they just need a little bit extra assistance with both their neighborhood growth and also physical transformation. So right now we're working in this area right here, which is Armstrong Park. So that is continuing the Love Where You Live program here in Plano. I had also mentioned our Great Update Rebate Program, and this really incentivizes reinvestment into older, moderately priced homes. And you can see that it's more widely spread out through both the darker green and blue neighborhoods, and it has been incredibly popular over the years. As mentioned, it was previously it was developed in 2014, but it won the U.S. Council of Mayors Livability Award in 2016. So this has been a great program for us and continues to be incredibly popular. So one of our earliest programs for neighborhood engagement was the pop-up party trailer. So this was a very low cost investment that has been a huge return for neighborhoods. Even the smallest cities, this is something that should be easily attainable and within their reach. Trailer has all that a neighborhood would need to have a block party, and we also provide planning and invitation assistance for neighborhood groups. We have improved it over the last 6 years by adding more games and party resources, and it continues to be an incredibly popular program. This map just shows how widely distributed the pop-up party trailer has been for use with block parties across Plano. And in 2021, we added the pop-up theater, and that is to watch videos or play games that can be reserved with the trailer or separately. So as we consider support for neighborhoods, we separate our resources into tiers based on where the neighborhood is for engagement and revitalization efforts. Middle neighborhoods typically fall into tier 1 and tier 2 programming, and I'm just going to quickly touch base on a few of these as we go through. But the whole of our neighborhood-based work is to reduce or eliminate the decline part of the section, and the neighborhood cycle is shown in the triangle. So we start first with neighborhood group registration, and this allows us to have better connections citywide for neighborhood leaders. It gives them an opportunity to be able to connect with each other for peer-to-peer exchanges as well. But this really is the entry level for neighborhoods to be able to access many of our neighborhood programs. This is a map of our current registered neighborhood groups, and you can look at this gap up here. This is a large retail and corporate campus area known as Legacy that was initially developed with Ross Perot. So these are some of the examples of both our help and our outreach programs. And just moving forward, I'm going to talk about our resident leadership development. We invest significant time and resources into resident leadership, and we consider this to be one of our strongest neighborhood revitalization strategies. Marcia had mentioned NERA, which is our Neighborhood Engagement Revitalization Alliance. We worked cooperatively to put together HOA legal clinics. So it's a regional access for neighborhood leaders across Dallas-Fort Worth. We also do a neighborhood summit, and we will be hosting that again this year, 2022 in Plano. So we had mentioned the neighborhood vitality and beautification grants. They provide both small and large beautification grants, as well as mini grants for engagement to help build neighborhood groups. We are still continuing to see activity with this, but it is not as widespread as we would like it to be. So we are continuing to look for ways to modify the program to expand into more neighborhoods. We have recently changed some of our grant requirements, especially for voluntary groups, so that we do more of a match if you are not mandatory, and then also trying to be more creative with use of volunteers. The pandemic has greatly slowed some of the neighborhoods from meeting and having volunteer programming, and so we ended up having some additional funds that we were able to use to do special grants to replace landscaping. We had some severe winter weather in Texas last year, and a lot of people lost a lot of vegetation, a lot of large trees, and so we did a special grant cycle to help those neighborhood groups that were responsible for landscaping across their community. So this map just gives you an overview of the impact of all of neighborhood services programs in the residential areas across the city of Plano. Our Middle Neighborhoods program has been really in development since 2015, and we just keep building on this foundation. There are several more programs that we just did not have time to touch on today, such as our Neighborhood Leadership Academy, our Good Neighbor Volunteer Program, and our Tool Lending Trailer. So we are always willing to try new things. We have done several pilots. Some have been more successful than others, but you just never know until you try. So we always encourage you to borrow ideas. Some of our greatest ideas, we looked at other cities and said, you know what, that's a great idea, and we'd like to borrow it and make it better. So we always think that, sharing in communities of practice such as this, in any forum really you can learn from each other is always the best way to continue to build your neighborhood-based work. And then as you can see for 2022, we're developing some new program called I Love Where I Live, which is really focused on community pride and connectiveness. And then we're also, as I had mentioned earlier, are going to be revisiting some of our housing studies that were completed in 2014 and 2018 to develop a new housing plan that is going to align with our newly adopted comprehensive plan. So that concludes my presentation for this morning. You can also learn lots more about our programming at the Neighborhood Services website, which is planoneighborhoods.org. You can also feel free to email me if you have any specific questions. But thank you for your time today, and I am going to turn it back over to Marcia.
Thank you so much, Lori. It's always so much fun to see what the next iteration is of your program array there and of your market analysis. We're going to open it up to questions now. So just put your questions in the chat or raise your hand. I think we're a small enough group that we can also unmute. Is it possible for people to unmute themselves, Anne? we'll find out about that. I never know between webinar mode and meeting mode. But while we're waiting for some other questions to come in for Alan and for Lori, I wanted to ask Lori if you could describe your Great Update Rebate program.
Sure. So Great Update Rebate is, as mentioned, it's for our moderately priced homes, older homes. So we have, you have to have a house that's 35 years or older. And then we index it off of the single family lending limits for I believe it's Fannie Mae. I'm not positive, but anyway, it's definitely one of the most important programs that we've had here over the last 7 years. And what we are seeing people do, it has the ability to have both interior and exterior investments. We do have a minimum investment, and like Arlington, we started at 20,000 because at the time we created the program, that was about 10% of the value. But the challenge that has happened is that when we started the program just 7 years ago, it really was about 200,000 was considered a moderately priced home. We have had to index it to almost 400,000 at this point because of the extreme growth of our housing market. And so we have left it at the 20,000, which seems to be sort of a sweet spot based off of our, we did an assessment in 2018 and 2019 of our Great Update Rebate to understand, you know, where were you getting the most the most improvement value, and really that 20,000 seems to be about right. We do give a rebate up to $5,000. It's a cash check to them. It's not based off of any sort of property tax valuation. It is not income qualified, so anyone across the city that has a house that meets that criteria is able to apply for the program. We typically run out of money every year and end up having a wait list. So it remains very, very popular, and we're seeing a lot of investment in our older neighborhoods, as shown by that map. But it's been something that we don't consider changing. I think we're still going to keep that on as long as our council continues to fund it. But there's a lot of support, and it's been very, very popular.
Do you have any idea what the most popular improvements are that people do?
Really, it's a lot of it is kitchens and bathrooms, you know, and then we also get a lot of exterior work. There are some exclusions, like we won't let you can't get the Great Update Rebate to build a new pool, but you can use the Great Update Rebate to rehab an existing pool, because we just have a lot of swimming pools here in Plano. And as with everything else, they age and need significant maintenance long term. And so we're at that point where it's really important to see that reinvestment in some of these other buildings and accessories, rather than just always into housing. And that, because they can actually become a public health and safety concern if pools are not maintained. So we are always exploring how best to figure out how to address the needs. And we still have some things that we're trying to figure out. And I'm sure that a lot of cities have similar challenges. We have retaining walls, we have you know, fencing. All of these things are expensive, and we're always trying to figure out ways to assist.
Great. You know, I also wanted to kind of pursue this issue of investors, because it's been a rapidly evolving phenomenon, right, throughout the country over the last couple of years. And I actually want to invite all of the participants on the call to just type into the chat and let us know, like, what is your situation with investors in middle neighborhoods? Are you seeing more of them, and are they buying and renting, or are they buying and just holding for equity, long-term equity growth? And Lori, you said that you have, that's sort of a big characteristic of your investor purchases. They're just holding them vacant and waiting for prices to rise, right?
Mm-hmm. We've seen some of that. I mean, I would say that generally we have a fairly low vacancy rate. One of the things that continues to be a concern is the number of rental properties, and, you know, especially housing affordability. I know that's an issue across the United States, but in strong growth markets, which I think that most of the Southwest is seeing, you know, especially like Phoenix and Albuquerque here in Dallas. It is a challenge because honestly, with some of the conditions that have come out of the pandemic as well, housing units are just not being built, and they can't be built as fast. I mean, you're seeing increased costs. So the challenge really comes is that every housing unit that's available needs to be livable and available. And so those remain concerns, but we're seeing a lot of investors coming in, especially national investors coming in to purchase homes for rental, and it is changing the way that the market reacts. We're seeing higher cost for housing, and it's difficult for first-time home buyers to be able to get into the market here. So that is continuing to be a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is definitely been an uptick in investor buying. I think there are a lot of different patterns. One thing that actually I've found is interesting is that there seem to be more investors who are willing to go into what were seen until relatively recently as very low value neighborhoods on the one hand, and they're clearly renting as much for cash flow, if not more so for cash flow than for appreciation. And my impression is the more expensive the housing market, the greater the possibility that somebody will actually hold on to their house, keep it empty for appreciation. Because when you get up to, let's say, San Francisco housing prices, you can't rent that house or apartment for enough money to make that much difference. The gap is so huge. But when you're talking about relatively low value neighborhoods, like I see Old Brooklyn and Cleveland, for example, your rent is a significant part of the sales price, and you can actually make quite a decent year-on-year cash flow return from renting out that house. So there are a lot of differences in the business models that investors have, but there's no question that it's certainly picked up. We saw a huge spurt after the foreclosure crisis, during and after the foreclosure crisis. Then it kind of never went away, but it kind of leveled off for a while. And now it's definitely looks like it's picking up again.
Yeah, Jamie Bauer, who's really keeps her finger on the pulse of the market in her neighborhood, Old Brooklyn and Cleveland. We've had her help out with a webinar in the past, and she's really facing, this sort of classic legacy city situation of bulk buyers just buying all kinds of stuff. It's modestly priced because the values are lower there, and they can pick up a lot of stock for what they consider to be very little money, to the point that, as I have heard it from Jamie and others, that they're really questioning their ability to influence the market in these neighborhoods anymore because so much of it is owned by absentee investors.
It's a really tough question, because I don't think from a legal standpoint, a municipality, I think, would be on extremely thin ice to say, we will not allow you to buy a house in the city of such and such unless you plan to live in it. You can't do that. On the other hand, I think what you can do, and where this becomes really important, is have really rigorous, serious landlord regulations. Have regular property inspections, hopefully start doing some of the multi-tier systems where you're distinguishing between good landlords and bad landlords, and concentrating on the problem landlords. Offer incentives for good landlords. If you're going to have landlords in your community, and we all are, you want them to be good landlords and the housing to be well maintained. And the only way you can be sure of that is by having an effective regulatory system set up.
Lori, do you have a landlord registration program?
We do not, but I have recently been asked about it. So
that's right. We did talk about that.
Right.
Yeah, it's one of those things that gets brought up periodically. Part of the challenge on that one is, I would say, is you would have to craft that program carefully to deal with the volume that might happen at the beginning. And then how do you manage it moving forward? I think that would be difficult for most people to absorb into their existing staff. We do, as I mentioned, have property standards or a code enforcement department within our department. And that we do have a multifamily rental registration program. So we do a registration and rental inspection program for multifamily, and we also do one for our hotel motel program because as most of us know, that ends up being that housing for a lot of people. And so it continues to be brought up. As of right now, I have not been given the direction by my city management or my city council to do it, but that could change at any time. So
Yeah, well,
we'll see.
I think I'm a passionate believer in proactive strategies to deal with landlords rather than waiting for the complaints to come in. But one thing, there's an interesting question, which is how will the projected increase in interest rates realistically affect the investor housing market? The answer is, as far as I can tell, probably less than they will affect the home buyer market. Home buyers are, with relatively few exceptions, dependent on the conventional mortgage market, which floats with the interest rates. Landlords tend to have much more diverse sources of capital, which tend to operate much more independently of the basic model of long-term interest rates. They can raise capital through stocks. A lot of them self-finance. Smaller ones operate through hard money lenders who've always had higher interest rates relative to the mortgage market. So I think the increased interest rates are going to impact home buyers much more than they will impact investors.
Yeah, I feel like there's got to be some, well, I will say it's very disconcerting for me to be in what I think is the middle of some great shift in our housing market, that you just can't reach a conclusion about it yet. You just have to be patient and wait for it to play out.
Yeah.
But this huge influx of investors into the market really feels like a big event.
Well, what happened, and if you sort of play it back a couple of years, we had during starting a couple of months after the pandemic hit, what amounted to almost a perfect storm of housing pressures. First, to pretty much everybody's surprise, there was a dramatic uptick in the demand for home ownership. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that mortgage interest rates were as close to zero as they've ever been in this country and are ever likely to be again. Meanwhile, we've been underproducing housing for the last decade, and it got even worse during the pandemic as people held their houses off the market for all kinds of reasons. So you had a huge growth in demand meeting a reduction of supply. That squeezed the home buying market. Also meant that an awful lot of people, not so affluent people, working class, middle class people, who had hoped to or expected to buy homes were frozen out of the housing market, which started to push rents up, which of course then started to drive the investors into the rental market, because now the ratio of rents was going up relative to prices. So we've gotten ourselves into a very problematic cycle. And for a lot of reasons, we've gotten not as good as we used to be about building more houses, normal people's houses, not McMansions, and normal people's apartments and middle market housing. And so the problem is, unless we really re-gear how we regulate land use, how we finance housing, how we make land available, how we develop a skilled workforce of construction workers, which is a big problem in many parts of the country, we are in for a long-term squeeze, I'm afraid. And when I read these, there are lots of blogs and op-eds about how to fix the housing crisis, how to end the housing crisis. Don't believe it. It's tough. It is really tough. And it's not just do this one thing and it will be fixed.
Lori, do you still have room for new construction in Plano, or are you completely built out?
We're not completely built out, but our residentially zoned land is very, very small at this stage. We really just grappled with for the last 2 years, sort of what is our growth policy going to be? And I'd mentioned that we had a newly adopted comprehensive plan, and that really was grappling with, you know, sort of what does growth look like now for the city of Plano? And there are still a lot of concerns, and there's a lot of question about sort of that idea of the missing middle housing, especially with our land prices being so extreme. You know, even entry level housing here is quite expensive at this point. And you know, I think people are just getting creative, and we're trying to figure out how do we make sure that we're taking care of our housing as infrastructure. I think that's a very key thing that people need to think about, is that our housing really serves as infrastructure. And for people that live in maturing cities like we have, you're having to invest a lot, you know, in your CIP programs in order to be able to really make sure that you're keeping all of that original infrastructure in good working condition. Well, housing is the same. And I think, you know, Alan made a very important point earlier is that a lot of these houses were built very quickly. You know, kind of 1960s, 70s tract homes. And a lot of them weren't necessarily intended for like a historic property. Like some of these, you know, historic buildings, they were made to last 200, 300, 500 years. Not necessarily what we saw in the late, you know, 20th century kind of development. And so I have a historic preservation background, so I pay a lot of attention to that. And I do think that that's going to be something that's going to be interesting, because then you end up seeing redevelopment of sort of basically that naturally occurring affordable housing, because that housing stock may not have been properly maintained, or really, you know, might not have been the best materials to start with. And so how do you make the choices to be able to have that redevelopment in a way that is going to supplement the housing choices that you have available in your own community, and not displace people? You know, it's not an easy solution. And I think that sadly, I think it's going to be a difference between neighborhoods sometimes, and understanding the housing stock that's there. But not everything can be saved. And I think you will see neighborhoods that will turn over and have brand new housing stock, because that's the kind of thing that happens just in growth cities. And then really sort of that idea of decline of neighborhoods and reinvestment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, in fact, Jamie makes a point in the chat. So there's huge differences between housing markets. And, you know, Dallas is one of the fastest growing regions in the United States. Plano is a very well situated suburban city within a very hot metro. Conversely, Cleveland and a lot of other cities in that part of the country, the market in terms of the incomes of the people and what is considered reasonable to buy a house is well below the cost of production. So it's ironic, an old neighborhood in Plano will be replaced by more newer upscale housing. An old neighborhood in Cleveland may just, unless somebody can figure out how to find the right magic to stabilize it or revitalize it, may just gradually deteriorate over time, because again, of the market, the lack of enough market demand to support the rebuilding. So, and then there are a lot of places in between. So, you know, it's a big country. And
Delonzo has his hand up. Anne, can you unmute him?
Yep, just a second.
While she's doing that, I will say one of my personal soapboxes is this is me speaking on behalf of me, not anything else, but that we as housing focused practitioners need to start looking at income advocacy as well, and to think about this growing, polarization of income in our communities. I think some problems are income problems that we can't really fix with a housing strategy. Go ahead, Delonzo.
I was about to say, I think you may have unmuted me. I'm Nichelle.
Oh.
Delonzo, I didn't have my hand up. There should be another Delonzo on this call.
Oh, okay.
Oops.
Okay.
We'll find you eventually.
Yeah, sorry, that's the only one I see. So
Okay.
that's the one.
Yeah, that's the only place. Maybe it was an accidental hand raising. Okay, well, so barring our sudden finding of the real Delonzo, it sounds like we're probably at a pretty good place to wrap this up. Anne, you want to pull up my closeout slides? We basically just want to encourage people to join us in the Middle Neighborhoods Community of Practice. All it takes is to go to our website, middleneighborhoods.org, look at the bottom of any page and sign up, and you can get either just our newsletter or get our newsletter and join our community practice. We'd love to have you. Oh, let's see, okay, that's okay. There still is the book On the Edge, America's Middle Neighborhoods, that has a lot of chapters, different chapters written by different people. As I mentioned, Alan wrote 2 of them. I wrote 1 of them. It really covers the gamut in terms of thinking about middle neighborhoods. Although there is I think if we were writing it again, we'd have a chapter on middle neighborhoods in the desert Southwest. I encourage you, if anybody on this call or anyone wants to start an affinity group within our community of practice for Southwestern middle neighborhoods, we'd be happy to support that. We have other affinity groups going or on the verge of launching, so that people who are particularly interested in one or another angle can talk to each other, and visit our website. Always feel free to email me directly, Marcia@middleneighborhoods.org, and we are happy to design a customized Middle Neighborhoods 101. April, we do not yet offer AICP credits, although Lori has been telling us more than once that we need to figure that out. So we will be looking into that. Thanks everybody for joining us, and Anne will do a follow-up email that will again send you the link to the report that Alan and I worked on, as well as the slides from this presentation, and probably a link to the recording of the webinar. Thanks again, everybody. We appreciate you being with us. And especially thanks to Alan and Lori for all the time and effort they put into this and sharing their insights.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.